The day I realized pleasure can fuck you up inside. Carl Jung. There was a day when pleasure seemed like a refuge to me, a short, sweet, almost perfect moment. It was as if the world fell silent for a few seconds, and my breath finally found a calm rhythm. But just like a tide that receded, leaving only marks on the sand, when the moment passed, what remained was a cold emptiness, a silence not of peace but of absence. And then I realized that that instant of relief carried within it the seed of a new prison. Carl Jung would call this the shadow, that which we seek to relieve pain, but which, deep down, reinforces the chains that already bind us. The shadow doesn't reveal itself at first. It disguises itself as comfort, as a deserved pleasure, as a reward. But little by little, it occupies the spaces that were once ours, and we begin to live in service to it. Seneca said that nothing is more harmful than a pleasure bought with future pain. It's a warning that seems obvious, but that we ignore when the reward is within reach. It's like drinking seawater. Quench your thirst. At the first sip, your mouth feels relieved, but the salt is already starting to corrode you from within. The more you drink, the more the thirst grows, and the faster you drown. Epictetus warned that what is pleasant for an instant can enslave for a lifetime. And this slavery doesn't begin with heavy chain, but with small, subtle, almost imperceptible tie, a habit, a constant search, a recurring thought that pushes us, without us realizing it, to the same place as before. Pleasure itself is not the villain. It can be nourishment, rest, celebration, but when it becomes the only path we choose to escape from ourselves, it stops being an ally and becomes an executioner. The day I understood this was the day I realized that it's not the sweet taste that hurt, but the blind attachment to it, because all pleasure is like fire. It warms and illuminates, but if you don't know how to contain it, it devours everything around, starting from within, the silent pact with one's own emptiness. There are moments when we don't seek pleasure for what it truly is, but for what it promises to hide. It's a silent agreement. I give you my attention, my time, my body, and you for an instant hide the weight I carry from me. Thus, we eat not out of hunger, but to silence anxiety. We spend not out of need, but to numb the feeling of insufficiency. We give ourselves, not for the bond, but to fill the space we cannot face. This pact stretch because it seems to work at first. The immediate pleasure functions as a heavy curtain, closing off the view of what is bothering. For a few minutes, it seems like nothing hurt, but like any curtain, it only blocks the view. It doesn't change what's there. And when the effect wears off, what was hidden not only remained, but often intensified. It's like sweeping dust under the rug. Sooner or later, we trip over it. The illusion of control is one of the most dangerous parts of this agreement. We think we are choosing when in reality, we are obeying an impulse shaped by the fear of discomfort. Every time we resort to pleasure as an anesthetic, we reinforce the message that we are not capable of enduring what we feel. It's as if we are telling ourselves, I can't bear to look at this. And so pleasure ceases to be a conscious choice and turns into an autopilot. There's a detail we rarely notice. Jung's shadow is nourished not just by our failures, but also by the excesses we use to cover them up. It is at this point that pleasure becomes an accomplice of emptiness, prolonging its stay. Because what is sought to escape pain, but does not solve its cause, is not a cure, it's a silent circle, where each turn leaves us farther from what could truly set us free. The pact with emptiness is, at its core, a negotiation with one's own forgetfulness. But there is no true forgetfulness when the root remains. There is only postponement, and every postponement charges interest. Interest that presents itself in the form of more need, more compulsion, and less freedom. When pleasure ceases to be a choice and becomes an escape, there is an almost imperceptible instant when pleasure stops being a visitor and becomes a tenant that occupies every space. At first, it arrives as a gentle invitation, a movie to relax, tasty meal, a purchase that seems deserved. Everything seems under control until we realize that we no longer seek it out of will, but out of necessity. It is at this silent moment that the line breaks and pleasure ceases to be a choice to become an escape. Seneca warned that pleasure without moderation turns a man into a servant of his own will. Servitude is the right word, because when impulse starts to decide for us, there is no longer any freedom. What was once a legitimate reward becomes an emotional anesthetic. And like all anesthetic, it doesn't heal. It just prevents us from feeling the pain while the problem grows in the background. The difficulty is in noticing when this transition happens. Compulsion rarely presents itself in an obvious way. It disguises itself as a harmless habit, a comfortable routine, something that everyone does. But the difference between a healthy habit and a disguised compulsion is simple. The first one you control, the second one controls you. And the clearest way to realize this is to notice if you can still say no without feeling an immediate emptiness or a growing anxiety. The escape through pleasure has a corrosive effect. It weakens our tolerance to discomfort and, at the same time, increases our dependence on stimuli. It's like building a house on the seashore without realizing that the tide is rising. Each wave seems harmless, but over time, the ground disappears from under your feet. When pleasure ceases to be a choice, it begins to shape our life around itself. The day revolves around creating space for it. Decisions align to facilitate it, and emotions begin to depend on its presence. And when that happens, it is no longer pleasure that is serving us. It is us who begin to serve. The dopamine trap, the invisible exhaustion. There is a kind of tiredness that doesn't come from work or lack of sleep, but from an incessant search for stimuli that are never satisfied. It's an exhaustion that seems to have no apparent cause, but which arises from the constant repetition of small, immediate reward. With every click, sip, bite, touch, or notification, the brain releases a breath of pleasure, but that breath dissipates quickly, leaving behind an emptiness that asks for more. And so, in a silent spiral, life begins to be moved not by meaning, but by small doses of dopamine. Marcus Aurelius said that the soul is colored by its thought, and when thoughts are always turned towards the next pleasure, they become restless and fragile. True rest disappears because even in moments of pause, the mind is searching for a next stimuli. It's like walking through an open field without ever stopping to feel the wind or notice the horizon, because your eyes are always looking for something new to capture. This excess has a paradoxical effect. Instead of relaxing, it exhausts. The body may be sitting, but the mind races as if it were forced to fill every second with something pleasant. And the more we try to satisfy ourselves, the farther we get from genuine satisfaction. It's like eating sugar to satisfy hunger. The energy comes fast, soon disappears, leaving an even greater need. The danger lies in the fact that this trap is silent. It is built on the accumulation of small habits that, in isolation, seem harmless, but together form a cycle of dependence, a cycle that robs the ability to be enchanted by the simple, to feel whole in quietude, to be satisfied with what is already present. The invisible exhaustion of dopamine is not just physical, it's existential. It separates us from ourselves because it trades depth for quantity, meaning for fleeting intensity. And when life becomes only the sum of quick pleasures, soul, once full, begins to become a shallow reflection of something that could have been more. The Stoic exercise to regain mastery. Regaining mastery over oneself is not a victory that is achieved in a single day, but a discipline that is practiced with every choice. It is the deliberate act of, from time to time, denying yourself something that would give you immediate pleasure just to feel the freedom of being able to choose. Because when we are not capable of saying no to what pleases us, we stop being the owners of pleasure and become its property. Stoicism teaches us that true strength is not in avoiding all pleasure, but in being able to enjoy it without becoming its hostage. This means, for example, exchanging a fleeting impulse for an action that brings lasting pride, giving up a small comfort to invest time in something that builds, that strength, that expands who we are. This exchange is not about punishment, but about reconquest. It is the rescue of the ability to decide with clarity. Recording how you felt at the end of the day when you resisted is a fundamental part of this practice, because the mind needs to perceive the difference between quick pleasure and the deeper satisfaction that comes from self-awareness. It is in this silent and honest record that one sees how self-control is not coldness but freedom. Epictetus reminded us that no one is free if he is not his own master. And a master of oneself is one who can accept or refuse what the world offers without losing their peace. This practice doesn't transform life overnight, but it begins to create fissures in the automatic cycle of the incessant search. Every conscious no is like a brick put back into the internal structure that sustains our dignity. And little by little, pleasure ceases to be the commander to return to its place, a guest who can enter but who does not dictate the rules of life. In the end, mastery is not over the world, but over one's own impulse. And when we learn to govern what we feel and desire, we realize that peace is not born from the absence of pleasure, but from the place we choose to give it in our life. Pleasure as a servant, not as a master. There is a silent but decisive difference between living with pleasure and living for pleasure. When it is a servant, it is at the service of life, bringing moments that warm, relieve, and celebrate. When it is a master, it dominates the internal space, dictates priorities, and imposes an invisible agenda that suffocates. Seneca said that he who gives himself to pleasure gives himself to a fickle master, and there is no more unstable tyrant than one who lives by the tides of desire. Cicero reminded us that true happiness is born from balance, not from excess. Pleasure can be like fire, useful for warming and illuminating, but capable of consuming everything when a limit is not set. The difference between the fire that welcomes and the fire that destroys lies in constant attention and the discipline to keep it in the right place. When we put pleasure in the place of a guest, it enriches the experience of living. It becomes a seasoning, not the main course. It can be present in small doses that strengthen emotional memory, that give color to the routine and meaning to celebration. But when it takes the throne, it begins to demand more, always more, until life itself begins to revolve around serving. The day we decide that pleasure is welcome but not indispensable is the day we reclaim the keys to our inner house. On that day, life stops being a race to satisfy impulse and becomes a path to building meaning, and pleasure, now in its correct place, can be enjoyed with gratitude and without fear. In the end, it's not about eliminating pleasure, but about freeing oneself from its dominance. Because the pleasure that serves is an ally, but the pleasure that governs is a prison, and living in peace is, above all, choosing which doors open and which remain closed within oneself. There comes a time when we realize that it's not pleasure that threatens us, but the position we give it. When we treat it as a master, we live to serve it, sacrificing time, energy, and even our own identity. When we treat it as a guest, it enters, brightens the environment, and leaves witut leaving death. Seneca warned that he who gives himself to pleasure gives himself to a fickle master, and understanding this is like regaining the reins of a horse that was running without direction. Cicero said that balance is the foundation, and balance is not built by denying pleasure, but by placing in the right measure. Like fire, it can warm or destroy, it can illuminate or consume. The wisdom lies in taking care that its flame does not spread beyond what is necessary. The day we decide that pleasure is a gift and not the owner of the house is the day life begins to breathe different. We start to find beauty in the pause, satisfaction in what is simple, and joy in what is real. Desire ceases to be an anchor that holds us and becomes a wind that pushes, but only to where we choose to go. Living this way is not about depriving oneself, it's about freeing oneself. It is understanding that peace is not measured by the intensity of the pleasures we experience, but by the freedom to be able to say yes or no without it enslaving us. Because true luxury is having a life where pleasure fit doesn't rule, where it adds but doesn't govern, where it is company, never a prison.